Ani bonjour, everybody. My name is Bailey Walkie. I'm the founder of Frayed Feathers and your host on the Frayed Feathers podcast. Miigwech for donating your time with me today, and let's jump right into it. I would like to unpack this report, not only to provide a more detailed summary and analysis and my anecdotal experiences, but I also want to break down the methodology informing this report and kind of like the culture around government processes and things like that. I think that would be especially helpful for folks who are not engaged as a researcher on these topics. And so we'll talk about that, and then this podcast will predominantly be focused on unpacking the video. There's just so much to get to, so let's jump into it. I won't be going into so much as re-summarizing what was done in the video, but I will be talking about all the things that were outlined in it. And so if you would find it helpful to be with a little bit of a refresher, I would implore you to go check out the other video and come back to this as just a moments later while it's still in your mind. So this is a typical order of operations for government in that they need to make informed decisions when spending money. So it's very important for them to find leaders who can lead the consultations with whichever demographic they need to collect information on, in this case being Indigenous youth. And then they will hopefully make a response shortly afterwards, and in this case they did. And so the underlying challenge with engaging Indigenous youth or any vulnerable demographic is that there is a barrier with consultation fatigue, meaning that people don't want to be consulted about the challenges they've experienced because they feel as though they've been consulted too much, and therefore there shouldn't be a need to consult more, right? Like if somebody hurt their knee, I go away and I come back and I say, what are your problems? And they're like, my knee still hurts. You know what I mean? Like eventually that person with the hurt knee is just going to become very frustrated, right? And so that's what's happening with colonization and reconciliation efforts, in that not a lot of things are happening, and it doesn't feel like there is a appropriate amount of prioritization by the government of Canada to push this work forward. And so in this context of Indigenous youth, it's very difficult to meet these engagements that are happening annually or biannually with any level of enthusiasm. And that was something shared throughout the document that people were unhappy with. You know, there's actually a quote here. It's actually there's something here in the report. It's not a quote, but just kind of, it's just written out, and I would imagine paraphrased. But they had conducted this national gathering. They had gathered 20 youth leaders across Canada to come to, I believe it was Ottawa, and they had done this gathering. And it says here, one of the youth leaders said that anyone remotely engaged in this space of Indigenous community building or advocacy already knows what is needed. It is the actual funding and support to make these programs happen that is lacking. And so it just goes to show that, you know, even in wanting to do good things in our communities and things like that, and, you know, thinking that, oh, well, I'll go talk to these people and they're going to want to tell me what's going on and then I can support them. It's not that obvious, right? And so with the methodology, it is common practice to have, so when doing community engagements, it is common practice in the way that this report was developed, in that there is multiple in-person discussion groups, there's an online survey component, and then lastly, they usually do an in-person gathering, whether it be at the front, at the end, or both. And usually it's a great conclusion to the project. And so lastly, the methodology to confirm or verify all the things that were said in those engagements, there is a select literature review done, which is really just to ensure that the things that are being shared in the community have been demonstrated through data, or maybe even other community members have talked about it. And that's just science, right? Like, we need to verify things, etc. And so there's not really much to talk about. I mean, the consultation fatigue is obviously something people need to be mindful of. So when conducting in-person discussion groups, doing those surveys and things. That's why it's so important that we are reciprocal, meaning that we offer honorariums. If there's a data component to it, we would ideally tell people exactly what their data is being used for, how they can use it. We'll give them access to it afterwards. I'm not saying that's what happened with this report, but like when we consider Indigenous data reciprocity and sovereignty, that's what those things mean, like on a very, very basic level, right? And so with all that being said, we'll jump right into the themes of engagement. So going off of what we just learned from the youth leader talking about how anyone being remotely engaged in this knows what's happening, I would say that in my experience, the themes that were shared in this report are quite common themes. I feel like in my experience, my anecdotal experience engaging with community, both through consultations but also through a supportive service role, is that these are aligned with my experience as well. I mean, I feel very represented in reading the report. These are very similar things that I would be saying too, and I think that that's really important when we consider like this is for Indigenous youth, right? It's for all of us. So, as a collective in our community, we understand what's good for us, I guess is the point. But I do think that there's a challenge in engaging youth, just generally, not just Indigenous youth, about high-level ideas and solutions to these huge, large-scale things, in that the vision is usually quite clear, right? We see that in the themes of engagement. We see that in the paraphrased quote from that youth leader talking about how, like it's really just the funding allocations that are missing to support the work and advocacy that people are putting forward. But I've seen in my anecdotal experience in where it's difficult for youth to offer concrete solutions because there's two major things that are hard to balance when you don't have a frame of reference. So the first one is the feasibility, and then also the authority in which you're working within. So for example, like when we engage a ministry, right? So in British Columbia, we have the Ministry of Child and Family Development. They're the people who support youth, who would support the youth while in care, etc. But they have specific authorities that they can and can't do, right? So, for example, we might say, well, youth need housing, and so you, being the youth ministry, should be developing housing operations for youth. Sounds pretty logical, right? But the challenge is that the ministry that just supports youth does not make housing allocations. Like that is for the Ministry of Housing to do, and the Ministry of Housing to determine which demographic they would like to build a housing operation for. Excuse me. And so if you're not a total nerd, it's really difficult to know those things, because really how we learn them is either we directly engage with them and they tell us, which is not the ideal because we always want to be talking to the right people and demonstrate our expertise by talking to the right people. But secondly, reading their service agreements and annual reports and like keeping up to date with their developments, right? Like these are all things that, yeah, of course, like anybody could do, but is it realistic? Like not really. And practically speaking, the only reason why I've done those things is because I work as a policy analyst. Like it's important for me to know these things, right? So when engaging with youth, I feel like we as in like the government of Canada, people who are consulting Indigenous youth, like expect youth to just like give them the solutions, right? Because that's the ideal, right? Tell me exactly what you want so I can't mess it up. But youth are not empowered to know all this information, right? Like I don't think that it's appropriate to expect someone to read all these things in order to engage with their government. Like I should, like, even as somebody who really cares about this work and have stayed engaged on it for years, I didn't know about all these things until I became a policy analyst, right? Like these engagements happened in 2017. I was in Seneca College at the time in Toronto, chilling in the First People's office. I was going to community events. I was going to consultations. I was trying to collect those $50 paychecks whenever I could in college, and I had no idea that this report for the roadmap to number 66 was being developed, right? And so, like, even if you care a lot and like you want to be involved, you're still challenged to be involved because there's all these different barriers, right? And so anyway, in this report, the reason why all this is important is because in this report they talk about how the Indigenous Youth Voices network will directly engage and support the government of Canada to support Indigenous youth on the terms and conditions set by Indigenous youth, right? But for the reasons I just outlined, it's not that youth can't comprehend these things, but rather they just lack the professional development opportunities to offer a refined approach, right? And so, like, it's kind of like in these scenarios, it's kind of like, well, why would I listen to you, Indigenous youth, if you don't even offer solutions that are within my frame of authority and feasibility, right? And so, like, while that's totally unfair, I feel like that's kind of what I've witnessed when leading engagements with Indigenous youth or just youth in general with ministries, right? Like, if you're not like so mindful of your P's and Q's and the way you talk about things, then like there can be like a switch that goes off in their mind. It's like, okay, I don't have any accountability to this person because they don't even know the parameters that would hold me accountable, right? And so that's, unfortunately, that's kind of how we have to operate. We need to work from a position of like, no, actually, I know exactly what your mandate is. And I know that if you don't follow through on what I'm saying, this is how I'm going to report it. And, it's sad that we need to approach youth reconciliation in a way that is at an arm's length with the people who are supposed to be supporting it, right? But that's just reality. Like, if we look at colonization, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, right? Like, why would I trust the government of Canada? Why I, meaning like Indigenous youth, right? Like, I think it is totally appropriate and reasonable to be skeptical of these things, right? So I would like to read a little excerpt from the report and kind of unpack it a little bit. We talked last week about how there is like a different spectrum of people who are engaged on reconciliation, and it's very difficult to understand where your lens is or which place you land on in that spectrum in which you're learning reconciliation from. And so I feel like this excerpt really gives a strong perspective into the reactions one would have by engaging on either end of those spectrums. So, quote, to the report, not a person. In relation to Indigenous Youth Voices and the TRC Call to Action number 66 specifically, some leaders at the National Youth Gathering expressed concerns about being seen as sellouts for engaging with a government initiative project, their voices not being heard or taken seriously, and Indigenous youth voices being co-opted or manipulated by the government. And so when we unpack this, like, really what it means is that Indigenous youth don't, like, the leaders, the Indigenous youth leaders are challenged to be accepted by some people within their communities, right? Like, they don't want to be seen as sellouts to their community members, right? Like, to the people who are supporting reconciliation, right? And so, how would I say this? This is really concerning in my opinion, because I think that any large change that happened in history is really about a community of people coming together, right? Like, we look at civil rights, we look at why the Berlin Wall fell, all these things, right? Like, enough people cared. But one of the big challenges to gathering these people is that there's infighting, right? Like, this is when we consider Indigenous people, and let's just keep it down to Indigenous youth. super, super vulnerable, right? Like there's so much need out there. And when people are in need, there's like a hyper reaction to correct it, right? Like if you're so far to the left, of course you would want to you'd want to be so far to the right. That's just natural. That's just a natural response. I don't want to be surviving. I want to be thriving, right? And so with that frustration, that passion these ideas, like it can be very difficult to not misdirect one's anger at the wrong people, right? Like in the context of Indigenous youth, like these youth are concerned about not being accepted by the other people who are pushing reconciliation forward. Like that's just sad, unfortunately. You know what I mean? Like I empathize with them. I don't want to seem like a sellout either. You know what I mean? Like, but that's just the reality we live in. And so I just wanted to offer that as some perspective. And so moving out of the themes of engagement and into the next steps now, I want to unpack a little bit about the model in which the Indigenous Youth Voices network is going to take. And so in the report, they had included a case study of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, or AHB. I think it's AHB because it's like Aboriginal Healing, you know what I mean? So it's AHB. I don't know. I don't know. I would expect it to be AHF, but it's not that. And so anyway, I just want to provide a very, very brief overview of what the case study is, because it's important to kind of frame how the Indigenous Youth Voices will go about their work. So firstly, established in 1998, the government of Canada provided an initial $350 million towards a healing fund to address the legacy of physical and sexual abuse in the residential school system. And so how they had done this is through three main formats. So the first one being funding. So they would be the funding body or the committee that would like if you were to apply for a grant, right? Like a grant committee, you want to develop this project or initiative, and it's aligned with supporting people through sexual or physical abuse experienced in residential schools, then this funding would be allocated to you, based off a point system or whatever their internal system was. Secondly was research. So they would they would conduct the research, doing those community engagements, ensuring that there is Indigenous customs represented there, people are feeling reciprocated, and overall just kind of managing that fuzziness around Indigenous engagements about reconciliation, right? There's a lot of challenges in the context of art. It can be very difficult for some people to engage about these topics, but it can also be difficult for people after they engage about these topics, right? And so that's why it's so important for a body of Indigenous leaders to be the leaders for research, right? So because they understand how to talk to this demographic, right? And so anyway, in continuing on with the research, they also had an integrated communication strategy. So they would conduct the research and then be the people who are communicating it, right? So they would host conferences, develop reports, conduct consultations, and even had a newsletter. And so Indigenous Youth Voices wants to take a very similar model through research, funding, and having an integrated communication strategy. But they are mindful of the mandate of AHB, which was to address physical and sexual abuse experienced in residential schools. And so being Indigenous youth, this is a demographic, but is also, this is a demographic that is represented in many levels many forms of support, right? So it's not just youth experiencing one specific challenge. They want to address a vast variety of challenges that Indigenous youth are experiencing in Canada. And so I just wanted to provide that as a frame of reference. If you are interested in looking into the case study, maybe I'll do a video on it in the future, but I don't think it's super important for people to know about. I think it's just especially helpful to provide context and a visual if this is something that you want to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive on. So now we're going to move out of the next steps section and go into the call to action to you. And I feel like this is kind of where my exercises are now going to kind of start to make a lot more sense to the viewer, in that this report to me demonstrates that reconciliation to Indigenous youth can mean many different things. And even in the report, it mentions that reconciliation, what it means and what it feels, what it looks like, is an evolving concept. And I think that it's very important to accept that, because when we look at the selected literature for the review, I mean, a lot of that stuff is like demonstrating that Indigenous youth have been saying the same thing for decades. And so if you are left to your own devices for decades in need, your needs have evolved. They're going to change, and maybe you're going to need more, maybe you need less, maybe you figured it out. But also, like, our world is changing, like the economy is not the same as what it was in, when did the TRC end? Like 2015? Like the economy is much different from 1998, right? Whenever residential schools finally closed, or the last one closed. And so so it's just important. So I feel like this report is beginning to uncover the vision a little bit of these exercises that I offer at the end of the videos, in that Indigenous youth reconciliation can mean a lot of different things. It has different entry points, and everybody's at a different stage in their healing journey. And even in the report, it says that reconciliation is an evolving concept. And I think that it's important for us as the audience and readers to accept that, right? Like, the context of need is much different from 1998 when residential schools closed, or 2007 when TRC started. And so, yeah, it's just really important to be willing to change our perspective of reconciliation, because not only are the youth themselves changing, but also the world, right? Like, youth engage with the world in a way in which nobody else in this world engages in them. That's why we feel like it's such a need to support them going through this developmental stage in their life, etc. But we can't implore the same strategies that worked in the world 10 years ago. Like, our world is changing so much. Like, my little brother is 8 years difference from me, and like, yeah, there's a lot of overlap, you know what I mean? But he has such a different perception, and that's just life. That's humans, right? And so, all this to say that regardless of the evolving concept or where it lands, youth are driven by overwhelming desire and need to make life easier and better for Indigenous people, right? And that's from the report itself. The people, the Indigenous youth that are being engaged in this project, have this overwhelming desire to make things better, right? And I totally empathize, that's why I have this channel. I want to make things better for people. And my goal is to bring action to this evolving concept, right? An overwhelming desire to make life easier for Indigenous youth and future generations is so broad, right? And I would implore you to consider, what does that mean to you? Like, how would you make life easier? For me, I think of convenience, financial safety, or financial planning. No, financial safety, pleasure/recreation, and prosperity. It's super important for me to have all four of these things if I want to like consider like what making life easier means, right? So for example, like convenience for me, what it means is like being having enough resources to accept convenience when it is convenient, right? So for example, if I was going to the airport, I had a horrible sleep, I'm not feeling good, I had to wake up super early, whatever it might be. Well, most of the time I wouldn't go buy a $6 water bottle, but in this time where I'm not feeling the greatest and I, would just like to have some convenience in my life because I'm not feeling well, it would be nice to have the money to spend on that $6 water. Now, is it going to feel good? Probably not, but it is good to have that convenience and knowing that it's not going to hurt me in having this convenience, right? Go into financial safety. I mean, you need financial safety in order to have convenience, right? You secure employment, you learn how to invest, and you achieve financial safety. That, to me, is what is making life easier. Pleasure and recreation. I taught dance for years. I was a beatboxer well, I mean, I'm not a beatboxer, but like I facilitate beatbox, right? And so it's really important for me to practice my hobbies. I really enjoy sharing my talents with people, and that's not unique to me. That is very common, right? We want to have community and things like this, and so hobbies, that recreation, and all the community events that are attached to those things, that to me makes life easier. And then of course prosperity. Prosperity is just all those things combined, right? Like having positive relationships with my fiance, with my siblings, with my parents, with my aunties and uncles, friends, family, all these things. And so all this to say, to make life easier, I'd imagine you could probably think of the ways in which you've made life easier, right? Whether it be through your own skills or like a service or something that you joined and gained from, etc. But then when we think about reconciliation as Indigenous youth living a prosperous life, then it demonstrates how there's so much need for a variety of sectors to come forward and support this demographic. Excuse me. And like I think another thing maybe we might be all be able to empathize with is that it took me so long to figure out how to function as a professional, right? Like it's really hard to learn how to do these professional things when you have no frame of reference to learn how to do them, right? And so those lessons that you carry in order to develop professionally and things like that can be understood as the vehicle to achieve Indigenous youth reconciliation in Canada, right? So Canadians, just in general, all Canadians need to consider how they can contribute to a national approach to reconciliation, right? And this is not like you need to go out and develop a roadmap to call to action number 66. But I would implore you to look at the video from yesterday, rewatch this or re-listen to this podcast and really consider how your teachable skill that you would be open to teaching people in teaching Indigenous youth would lead to a more prosperous life for Indigenous youth, right? And so you're allowed to define a prosperous life however you would like. You know what I mean? Like in the event in which you were actually to share this teachable skill with Indigenous youth, you could simply just make the promotional material, and whoever doesn't accept your idea of a more prosperous life just won't show up, and the people that do accept it will show up, and that's really how simple it is. And so not only in the practical approach to offer these things, but also just like making the effort, right? Like showing up for Indigenous youth is leaps and bounds more than what other people have done for Indigenous youth, right? And so I think it's really important for everyone listening to this who is motivated to do this work to not consider your gifts as a small thing, like in our lives, sometimes we hear one piece of advice, we go to 1 hour-long session, and it just changes everything for us. It makes something click, and maybe it's not that you offered some sort of revelatory or revelation to these youth, but rather maybe you said something that made them accept these 5 other things that they've been learning but didn't quite get, right? And so anyway, all that to say, you matter. You're part of the vision, and Frayed Feathers, my goal is to bring you along through that vision through my own services, right? And so we're going to wrap this up. We're going to go into the runway. We're going to jump into the conclusion, and that my goal is to make it clear that reconciliation is for all of us to support. And we have an opportunity in the coming years to build a foundation for the next generation to have a better future, right? Like, I envision my work and Frayed Feathers to grow like a snowball. Some of us in these early years of reconciliation might have to walk, but we're going to set it up so the next generation can sprint, right? That's my goal with this work. And so one of the 3 barriers I would say to this work is that it's dependent on, is that the public needs to care, voters need to care, and youth need to vote more, right? I think that that's like just the foundation, right? Once we have these 3 things, that's whenever real stuff begins happening, right? Like when you have voters who are showing up for politicians, so they're motivated to support those people because they want their votes. You have people in the public always hounding those public servants, those people who are, I shouldn't say public servants, but you get the point, those politicians, through ministry emails and letters saying, hey, you said you were going to support Indigenous youth. What have you done for them since? And what I want to do is like offer templates for people. You can just copy paste, you can send it off to your minister, and boom, you're an advocate right there, right? So in Frayed Feathers offering practical paid services to realize the vision of reconciliation, I'm also going to be offering clear and practical strategies that are free approaches to moving forward on this work, right? And so even if you're someone who doesn't want to offer a teachable skill or, do XYZ thing that is out of your comfort zone, there is still going to be a place for you in this community to support the initiatives that are happening. You don't need to be a leader to support reconciliation, and you don't need to have a lot of resources to do it. You just need to have a commitment and the drive to support a cause in your community. And so lastly, some of the exciting news that I'd like to end the podcast with is that I've been working with a youth advisory committee in my network, and we're going to pilot my Reconciliation Sprint. And so I won't get too into it, but basically it's a process that I talked about last week, which is a mixture of facilitation and consultation. And it's all about working with a group of people. This group can be a corporation, a small business, a school, hospital, nonprofit, correctional facility, and I support them to action on reconciliation to Indigenous youth, right? So this is going to be an intensive process, and I'm super looking forward to it. I'm going to develop a case study for it as well. I'm going to develop a case study for it, and I'm probably going to unpack that on the podcast. I don't think I'll do a video on it just because my videos are more about research, and I don't think that, well, that is a case study, but it's more something that I want to be able to talk about freely in this kind of in this unstructured format. And so anyway, if you'd like to learn more about that, please stay tuned, subscribe. Miigwech for donating me your time today, and look forward to catching you next Monday. Peace.